Imagine walking through an Appalachian forest and discovering that an entire town once stood beneath the trees. Homes, schools, churches, mines, stores, and railroad tracks were here, and then the people began to disappear. Some towns died when the coal ran out. Others collapsed when logging ended or railroads changed. And in some valleys, families were forced to leave as the land became part of a national park. But here is what makes these places disturbing. The buildings and foundations sometimes survived long after the people were gone. Today, we're counting down 11 forgotten Appalachian communities. And by number 1, you may never look at these mountains the same way again. Number 11, Elkmont, Tennessee. At number 11 is Elkmont, Tennessee. Today, Elkmont looks like a quiet mountain destination surrounded by trees. But more than a century ago, this was a busy Appalachian community built around timber, railroads, and the people who worked there. Large-scale logging reached the Elkmont area in the early 1900s. The Little River Lumber Company built a railroad into the mountains, making it possible to move enormous amounts of timber out of the forest. And once the railroad arrived, Elkmont changed rapidly. A real town developed. There was a company store, a church, a school, a hotel, a machine shop, employee houses, and railroad tracks running directly through the community. At its height, Elkmont had more than 1,500 residents. Imagine that for a moment. The same landscape where visitors now see forest and historic cabins was once filled with workers, families, trains, and the constant activity of a logging town. But the entire community depended on one thing: timber. And the timber was disappearing. By 1925, the lumber company had finished logging the area around the original town. The railroad tracks were pulled up. The town was closed, and the people moved on. Elkmont's disappearance was not caused by one terrible night. There was no single explosion, no sudden disaster. The industry simply finished what it came there to do. The forest had supplied the town. Then the forest was exhausted, and the reason for the town's existence disappeared with it. Today, some of Elkmont's historic buildings still survive. The forest has grown around them. The old railroad grade has become part of the landscape. And if you know what to look for, you can still find clues that a busy community once stood here. Elkmont is a perfect example of what happens when an entire town is built around a resource. When the resource disappears, the town can disappear with it. And this is only number 11, because the next community was abandoned for a very different reason. Number 10, Hensley Settlement, Kentucky. At number 10 is Hensley Settlement, high on Cumberland Mountain in Kentucky. In 1903, Sherman Hensley moved his family to the mountaintop. Other families eventually joined them. And what began as one family became a small Appalachian community of around 100 people. They farmed. They raised animals. They traded with neighboring communities. They went to church. And their children went to school. For more than 4 decades, this isolated settlement functioned as a real community. But there was a problem. The modern world was changing around them. Roads were reaching other Appalachian communities. Electricity was spreading. Jobs were changing. Transportation was becoming easier. But Hensley Settlement remained isolated. No road ever reached the community. No electricity arrived. The settlement was becoming increasingly disconnected from the world around it. And slowly, families began leaving. By the late 1940s, many residents had moved away. The settlement's population continued to shrink. Eventually, Sherman Hensley was the last person remaining. He left the mountain in 1951. The community was over. But something remarkable happened afterward. The buildings survived. Cabins remained standing. The schoolhouse remained. The church remained. Barns and other structures remained scattered across the mountain. Today, visitors can walk through the preserved settlement and see the physical remains of a community that once had around 100 people. But there is something strangely powerful about that silence. The buildings are still there. The fields are still there. The mountain is still there. The people are not. Hensley Settlement proves that a town does not always need a mine or a railroad to disappear. Sometimes, isolation itself becomes the reason people leave. And number 9 shows what happens when an entire community is tied to something much more dangerous: coal. Number 9, Blue Heron, Kentucky. At number 9 is Blue Heron, also known as Mine 18, in Kentucky's Big South Fork region. Blue Heron was created by coal. The Stearns Coal and Lumber Company operated the mine from 1937 until December 1962. For 25 years, hundreds of people lived and worked in this isolated mountain community. There were homes, a school, a church, a company store, a train depot, and above everything stood the enormous coal tipple. For the families who lived there, Blue Heron was not a ghost town. It was home. Children grew up there. Workers went underground. Families built their lives around the mine. But the mine itself had a problem. The coal did not last as long or perform as well as expected. As mining methods changed, the economics became more difficult. The operation continued, but profitability became increasingly difficult. Finally, in December 1962, the mine closed because it was no longer profitable. And when the mine disappeared, the reason for the community disappeared too. People left. Buildings were removed or deteriorated. The town slowly vanished. Today, Blue Heron is preserved as a historic site. The giant tipple still dominates the landscape. But many of the buildings are represented by metal frames showing where structures once stood. And that creates an eerie effect. You can see where a store was, where a school stood, where families once lived. But there is no town there anymore. Only outlines. Only foundations. Only the memory of a community built around a mine that eventually ran out of economic life. Blue Heron shows how quickly an industrial town can disappear when its central industry stops working. And number 8 is even stranger, because its name sounds like something that should never have become a town in the first place. Number 8, No Business, Tennessee. At number 8 is No Business, Tennessee. Yes, that is the actual name of the old Appalachian community. No Business developed along No Business Creek in what is now Big South Fork National River and Recreation Area. Its history reaches back to 1796, when Richard Slavin became the area's first permanent settler. Over generations, families built farms and homes along the creek. The settlement grew into one of the larger communities in the region. At its height, more than 300 people lived there. Families included the Crabtrees, Blevins, Boyetts, Burks, Slavins, and Millers. For generations, this was simply home. But No Business had one major disadvantage. It was isolated. There was limited land. There were limited jobs. And transportation through the rugged mountains was difficult. As the 20th century progressed, the younger generation began looking elsewhere. World War II accelerated the change. Many young men left to serve. And after experiencing life outside the mountains, some were no longer willing to return to the isolated lifestyle their parents had known. The decline of logging and mining made things even worse. One family left, then another, and eventually, almost nobody was left. In September 1960, Dewey Slavin became the last person to leave the community. Think about what that means. A settlement that had existed since 1796 finally ended with one person walking away. There was no dramatic final scene, no giant fire, no sudden catastrophe, just a community becoming smaller until there was almost nobody left. Today, much of No Business has disappeared beneath the forest. And that may be the most haunting part. The mountains did not destroy the community. Time did. Number 7, Nuttleburg, West Virginia. At number 7 is Nuttleburg, West Virginia. Deep inside New River Gorge, Nuttleburg once stood as a major coal mining community. When the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway reached the gorge in 1873, coal from the mountains could finally be shipped to industrial cities far beyond Appalachia. Nuttallburg grew rapidly. By the beginning of the 20th century, it was a bustling mining town. Homes climbed the hillsides. Workers filled the mines. Families depended on the coal industry. And then, in the 1920s, one of America's most famous industrialists became connected to the town, Henry Ford. Ford leased Nuttallburg's mines as part of an attempt to secure coal for his company's steel operations. His company invested in the mine in town. For a moment, it seemed like Nuttallburg had found a powerful future. But Ford's plan had a major weakness. He could not control the railroad that transported the coal. Without control of transportation, his plan for complete industrial integration could not work. Ford sold his interests in 1928. Nuttallburg continued under other owners. But the market for New River coal was changing. Production declined. And in 1958, mining finally stopped. Once the mine closed, the community's economic foundation collapsed. People moved away. Buildings were abandoned. The forest slowly reclaimed the landscape. Today, Nuttallburg is one of the best preserved coal mining landscapes in the United States. But look closely and you see something different. Empty buildings, old foundations, industrial structures, and trees growing where people once worked. The town did not simply disappear. It was slowly swallowed by time. And the deeper you look into New River Gorge, the more abandoned communities you find. Which brings us to number 6. Number 6. Kmore, West Virginia. At number 6 is Kmore, deep inside New River Gorge. Kmore was built around coal mining. The community developed around a mine that operated in one of the most difficult landscapes imaginable. The gorge was extremely steep. Kmore Bottom sat near the river, while Kmore Top occupied the plateau above. Workers and their families depended on a complicated industrial system connecting the two. Homes were built near the mine. Stores served residents. Children attended school. Families created a community in a place that was difficult to reach. But Kmore's location eventually became part of its problem. The mine's remaining coal reserves were becoming exhausted. The company considered new mining methods, but the costs were too high and the remaining coal was not enough to justify the investment. Beginning in 1955, residents of Kmore Bottom were moved out. Then, in 1958, a major fire swept through the area and destroyed most of the homes that remained. Mining continued for several more years, but the community was already finished. The mine finally closed in 1965. Today, Kmore is reached by a steep trail into the gorge. Visitors can see industrial remains clinging to the mountainside. But the homes are largely gone. The families are gone. The school is gone. The everyday life is gone. What remains is the industrial skeleton. And that is what makes Kmore so powerful. The ruins show you the machinery of the town, but they also show you how completely the people disappeared from the landscape. Kmore was not abandoned because people suddenly stopped caring about their homes. They left because the economic system that supported those homes had collapsed. And number 5 takes that same idea in a completely different direction. Because this next town wasn't built around a mine. It was built around the railroad. Number 5. Thurmond, West Virginia. At number 5 is Thurmond, West Virginia. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Thurmond was a classic Appalachian boomtown. Coal poured into the town from surrounding mines. Railroads carried it away. 15 passenger trains could pass through in a single day. The depot served tens of thousands of passengers every year. Hotels were full. Stores were busy. Banks handled enormous amounts of money. Thurmond was not some isolated mountain settlement struggling to survive. It was an important transportation center. But then the system changed. The Great Depression damaged businesses. Coal mines around the gorge began closing. And then came the technological change that hit Thurmond especially hard. The railroad switched from steam locomotives to diesel. That change might sound simple today, but for Thurmond, it was devastating. Steam locomotives needed water. They needed coal. They needed maintenance. They required large crews and specialized railroad infrastructure. Diesel locomotives needed far less of that support. The jobs disappeared. The railroad facilities became unnecessary. Businesses closed. Residents moved away. The boomtown slowly became a shadow of itself. But Thurmond is different from some of the other towns on this list. It was never completely erased. Today, the town is still incorporated. Historic buildings remain. The railroad still passes through. And the National Park Service preserves the historic district. But the Thurmond of the early 1900s is gone. The hotels are no longer overflowing. The stores no longer serve crowds of coal workers and passengers. The streets no longer sound like a booming railroad center. Thurmond proves something important. Sometimes a town doesn't disappear physically. Instead, the world that made it important disappears. And when that happens, a once busy town can become almost frozen in time. Number 4. Proctor, North Carolina. At number 4 is Proctor, North Carolina, along Hazel Creek. Long before today's quiet forests surrounded the area, Proctor was part of one of the great logging operations of the Southern Appalachians. Large-scale logging transformed the valley in the early 20th century. The Ritter Lumber Company built a railroad into the Hazel Creek watershed. The railroad connected the timber country with the company's mill at Proctor. And around that industry, a community grew. Workers needed homes. Families needed stores. Children needed schools. The community needed churches and other services. The forest became an industrial landscape. Trees were cut. Logs were transported. Railroad trains moved through the mountains. For the people who lived there, Proctor was not a forgotten place. It was their home. But the same logging operation that created the town was consuming the resource that supported it. The Ritter Lumber Company stopped operations in the Hazel Creek area in 1928. The logging boom was over. Then another transformation came. Fontana Dam changed the surrounding landscape during the 1940s. Communities in the region were displaced or altered as the reservoir was created. The old industrial world of Hazel Creek disappeared. Today, historic remains still tell part of Proctor's story. The forest has returned. The old industrial landscape is much quieter, and the railroad that once connected the community to the outside world is gone. Proctor represents one of the most important patterns in Appalachian history. The town grows because of the forest, and then the forest outlasts the town. But the next community was even larger, and for a time, it was the biggest settlement in the Great Smoky Mountains. Number 3. Cataloochee Valley, North Carolina. At number 3 is Cataloochee Valley, North Carolina. Today, Cataloochee can look like a peaceful mountain valley untouched by modern life. But that appearance hides a remarkable past. For generations, families farmed here. They built homes, barns, schools, churches, stores, orchards, and roads connecting one family to another. By 1910, around 1,251 people lived in the combined Cataloochee communities. That made it one of the largest communities in the Great Smoky Mountains. This was not an isolated handful of cabins. It was a real Appalachian society. Children went to school. Neighbors helped each other with harvests. Families gathered at churches and stores. Visitors even came to stay with local families. Then the future of the valley changed. The movement to create Great Smoky Mountains National Park gained momentum. Land purchases began. Families were asked to sell their property. Some agreed. Some resisted. Some were allowed to remain under lifetime arrangements. But the old community could not continue indefinitely. As families left, the population declined. Schools and services disappeared. The valley gradually became part of the protected landscape we know today. And this creates one of the strangest contradictions in Appalachian history. The community disappeared partly because the land was being preserved. The forest was protected. Historic buildings were saved. The landscape was maintained. But the people who had lived there for generations were largely gone. Today, visitors can see historic homes, barns, churches, and other structures. The buildings survived. The valley survived. But the community itself did not. Appalachia is therefore not simply an abandoned town. It is a reminder that preserving a landscape can sometimes mean the end of the human community that once shaped it. And number 2 takes that story to one of the most famous valleys in the entire Smokies. Number 2, Cades Cove, Tennessee. At number 2 is Cades Cove, Tennessee. Today, millions of visitors come here for mountain views, wildlife, historic cabins, churches, barns, and the famous Loop Road. But Cades Cove was once a living community. The first European settlers arrived in the valley around the early 1820s. By 1830, the population had already reached 271. By 1850, it had grown to 685. And by 1900, the population was about 708. Families farmed the valley. They built houses and barns. Churches became centers of community life. Stores provided supplies and social connections. Children attended school. For generations, Cades Cove was home. Then the creation of Great Smoky Mountains National Park changed everything. Land acquisition began during the 1920s. Some residents sold their property. Others resisted. Some families received life leases that allowed them to remain for the rest of their lives. But the community was slowly breaking apart. As residents left, services became unnecessary. The last school closed in 1944. The post office closed in 1947. The valley was becoming something different. Not a working community, a preserved historical landscape. Today, visitors can still walk inside the old buildings. You can stand inside churches where families once worshipped. You can see the homes where people raised children. You can walk past fields that were once worked year after year. And that is what makes Cades Cove so powerful. The buildings create the impression that the people simply stepped away for a moment. But they didn't. The community is gone. The family scattered. The old way of life ended. What remains is a carefully preserved snapshot of Appalachian life. Cades Cove, therefore, tells us something important. Sometimes history does not disappear because the buildings are destroyed. Sometimes the buildings survive perfectly well. It is the people who disappear. And that brings us to number 1. A community where logging, railroads, industry, and preservation all collided. Number 1, Smokemont, North Carolina. And at number 1 is Smokemont, North Carolina. Today, Smokemont is surrounded by the forests of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It is quiet, green, and peaceful. But that landscape once looked very different. The area was once known as Bradleytown. Then logging transformed the community in the early 20th century. The Champion Fiber Company became a major force in the area. A lumber operation developed. Railroads pushed into the mountains. Sawmills processed timber. Workers arrived. And around the industry grew a community with stores, churches, housing, and other facilities. For the people living there, this was not wilderness. It was a working landscape. The sound of sawmills and trains was part of everyday life. The forest itself was an economic resource. But the logging boom could not continue forever. Timber operations eventually declined. Then came the creation of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. In 1934, the park was officially established. More than 1,200 landowners ultimately had to leave lands within the park, leaving behind farms, mills, schools, churches, and other buildings. Smokemont's industrial world was transformed. The railroad disappeared. The lumber operation disappeared. The workers moved away. The community changed beyond recognition. But some pieces survived. The Smokemont Church still stands. Historic structures remain. And the old landscape still contains clues to the people who once lived there. Today, the forest seems to dominate everything. But the forest is actually hiding a much more complicated story. Underneath the trees were homes. Near these mountains were railroad tracks. In this landscape, workers once cut timber, and families built their lives. And that is why Smokemont belongs at number 1. Not because it was the most terrifying, not because it vanished overnight, but because it represents the larger story of Appalachia itself. People came into the mountains. They built communities. They worked the land. They built industries. Then the industries disappeared. The communities emptied. And eventually, the forest began growing around what was left behind. The mountains did not forget these people. They simply became quiet enough that their stories were harder to hear. 11 communities. 11 different endings. Some disappeared when mines closed. Others faded after logging, railroads, isolation, or the creation of protected lands. But their stories are still here, hidden in cabins, foundations, churches, rail beds, and forests. If you want more forgotten Appalachian stories, subscribe now, because the next mystery is already waiting in the mountains.